Okay, you're live.
All right. Welcome and thank you all for joining today. We'll go ahead and get things going. Sure, Petra's already taken the role. We're going to skip approval of minutes and defer that to our next meeting. So at our next meeting, we'll deal with 2 sets of minutes. And so the first thing we have on the agenda is a presentation from DJ. I see DJ on here. So hopefully you're ready to go, DJ.
Yep.
Make sure you can share.
I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Is everybody able to see?
Yes.
All right. And you guys can hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to give Norm 1 second to mute his mic so that we don't have the echo. All right. I have been working on modeling the groundwater characteristics and conditions on Kiowa Island. Sorry, I think we've got it going now. So obviously we're looking at the water system on Kiowa, and that includes the deltas, ponds, lakes, etc. And we've been doing so to better understand the water usage and monitor the size and health of the vadose zone to prevent long-term issues with relation to sea level rise and increased salinity. Because as the vadose zone becomes thinner, it invites increased salinity, leading to vegetation shifts. So I wanted to just briefly look at what the Dutch dialogue, which is a predictive measure to see what long-term effects of sea level rise will look like on the island. And so since we're looking at many areas that are going to be within those areas of issue, we can expect that we're going to need to be proactive in the solutions that we use. So first I wanted to outline kind of how saltwater intrusion mechanisms can occur. So there are 2 main ways that we looked at for the study, which is high or king tide percolation. So this occurs during storms where you start to see high levels of tide running over land and percolating downward into the system, creating vertical saltwater intrusion that way. And the second method we looked at is mean sea level rise, because water likes to flow from high to low, as we typically like to have the freshwater system be elevated higher than that of the saltwater system. And as sea levels continue to rise, we start to see the flow direction potentially changing, which can be a major concern for barrier islands such as this. So the way that we monitored this was we installed a series of wells across the island that were ranging from like 12 and 18 feet using the Eichel Camp kit, which is a combination of augering and direct push. And these wells took about 2 hours to install each, and we've installed 21 across the entire island. We selected sites based on availability of land, based on characteristics like who owned it. And then we also selected them based on geologic features such as what the geology of the area is, elevation, proximity to different feature that we're interested in, such as whether it's in the marsh or close to the coastline, etc. And so within each of these wells, we installed these data loggers. There are 2 types I show here. The first on the left is the black one, that's the LTC logger, which captures water level, temperature, and salinity. And the second, the silver one, is able to capture just temperature and the height of the water table. We collected this data in 30-minute increments throughout the entirety of the study, which is about a year at this point. And using this data, using the collectors, we were able to get a very robust set of data that allows us to have a lot of different predictive tools. For this study, we focused on how the tides were influencing it, but as I'm going to get into a little bit later, there are tons of different ways that we can use it. And the third method that we used throughout the study was using Solent's level tape to capture conductivity levels at different heights within the water table, based on or done in each of the different well locations. And I went ahead and in each one of these, I was able to create a salinity profile based on 1 foot increments to see how salinity changes with depth. So using the data that we collected, we started by mapping the water table at high tide. As you can see, this is the general shape based solely on the wells. And you'll notice there are like these bullseyes. That's locations where the wells were. And we basically wanted to improve the accuracy of this model. And so we look at low versus high tide, and you can see there's little change. But we wanted to look at what features influence the island at large. And because the wells are only about an inch or so in diameter, we wanted to look at larger water features on the island. So we decided to make a model based on the ponds, and that's what this model is. And you'll notice that it does capture the general shape of the water table at large, but it does a poor job of giving you good local data for what's going on in a specific area, which was the power of the wells. So this model here is a combination of both the wells and the ponds to create what I think is the best approximation of the water table, because it includes very local data as well as the overarching scale that is provided by the pond data. So I'll show this at high and low tide. You'll notice there's not much difference. This is actually one of the places that we're looking to improve because we only had the pond data for different static periods. We can't capture like month to month dynamics. And so that's one of the features that I'm going to get into a little bit later, talking about as an improvement. But I wanted to show here, we also looked at the wet versus dry season, which is actually extremely interesting. You'll notice that the water table is actually thicker during the dry season as opposed to during the wet season, which is caused in large part by the evapotranspirative demand of the overlying vegetation.
DJ, I've lost your screen somehow.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll stop sharing and I'll pull it back up.
I still see
Still
it.
got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll go back up. Are you able to see now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I don't know what happened.
It's no issue. If there are any other issues, just let me know, and I'm happy to share my screen a second time. So yeah,
DJ, these maps that you're showing us, I'm not clear of what is feet above NAVD 88.
right. So that's
Water level or
yeah,
land elevation? What is
water level above NAVD 88.
so this is groundwater level above that.
The best way to read it is it's water level and groundwater level are the same for above NAVD 88. So that's what it's reporting, is what the groundwater was when he says feet above NAVD 88. Another way would have been for him to take the land surface and show it as a subtraction from the land surface to show how far under, but you'll be seeing that in a little bit. Okay?
Does everyone understand? Does everybody understand what NAVD 88 is?
I do not. I want that
I
defined.
don't either.
Okay, you want to do it, or you, okay? So NAV, sorry, I'm rolling between the two screens here. As you can see, we're in the same room, but only he has a microphone on. So NAVD 88 is the standard datum for North America that defines elevation data, both ocean and land data being set to NAVD 88. So everything is talking about elevations at the same height. It's the one we use for understanding mean sea level. It's the one we use for understanding mean low water, mean high water, as well as it's how we compare so we know what the true elevation on something is. Okay? So it's the datum that defines our region for the North American vertical datum created in 1988.
It is a reference
Yeah.
point.
But
It is not.
looking at this with
It is not anything physical.
No,
it is not a physical plane. It's a reference point, and then we're looking at things with relation to that. So how far above that is. That's what we're looking at here.
how far above the zero of NAVD 88 it is. So the zero of NAVD 88 is what you would think of as the true when I say a true zero, to call it mean sea level is a misnomer, but it's what when you notice that it says mean sea level will have a certain height at NAVD 88 for an area. It'll actually always refer to that datum. Okay.
Like if you imagine a flat surface as NAVD 88, which it's not obviously, then what we're looking at is what's going above NAVD 88, kind of like this, like on a plane.
Okay, so in my cartoon world, blue is good and taupe is bad. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
Right, so we
Very-
want more feet above NAVD 88. This is freshwater we're looking at, right?
Right.
Yes.
And I'm going to just say this. I have to teach DJ how to flip his scale because I try and put the highest area at the top of my screen and the lowest at the bottom. That might have also made it easier to interpret as well.
Okay.
So red is bad, blue is good.
Okay.
And the numbers there are the absolute height in feet of that water table.
Okay.
No, maybe to give us an idea of where NAVD 88 is, maybe you could tell us where the mean sea level, mean high tide values are in numbers related to NAVD 88.
I took that part out because I thought it was going to be extra. I mean, it's just a matter of turning it back on.
Hang on 1 minute because we do have some slides that have that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how much interest there was going to be in that specifically, so I wanted to keep it short. If you'll give me just a second.
Well, I think the maps are wonderful and are telling us, where the groundwater is and relative height. It's just that I think general public is not going to understand any of 88 or what it would be related to. It is a independent reference point. Mean mean sea level locally is such and such related to that. Mean high water is a value related to that reference. And that just gives us an idea of what we're talking about, I think.
This brings back memories of the original sea level rise study.
Yeah.
We spent hours on this.
Yes.
Yes, we did.
That's exactly what this is. This is the standard that is used for understanding all sea level rise studies. It's the base datum, and to understand where on the map that you had here, point out to them with your cursor right now because they should be.
I'm
Share
not
it again.
sharing.
Share again.
When we see that it's 1 or 2 feet,
Show that it's where.
what is that in relation to where
It's shallower.
the ocean level is?
Right in here is deeper.
Well, the water is further down,
Mhm.
right? So versus NAVD 88. Yes, it's further down. Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right.
So I noticed that in the town council's comprehensive plan, one of the things that they were interested in looking at was actually the groundwater lens. And so what I decided to do for this project was look at how the groundwater lens is impacted by high and low tide. And so what you'll see in this high tide model is actually that during high tide, the underlying tides force the groundwater table vertically and compress it. And then if you look at low tide, you see that you're not seeing that compression. And that is in fact giving us further influence that there is likely tidal, or that the groundwater lens itself is being affected tidally. And I want to show that in another way. I'll show a little bit later. But before I do that, I wanted to show where we're actually seeing salinity on the island. So as you'd likely expect, the areas that are tidally fed, such as out in the marsh, and some of the areas that are closer to the center that are also being fed, by deltas have higher salinity and can have salinities up to an order of magnitude beyond what we see across the rest of the island, which is especially interesting. And so to help pull out how we're seeing this, I wanted to look at the groundwater lens in a cross section across the island. And I've done this for each of the cross sections throughout that I'm showing here, A through F. But for the purpose of this part, I just highlighted some of the more interesting findings. So the first is you'll notice that the blue line is the DEM for the area. The orange line is the well pond level, which is the water table that we modeled. And the gray line is actually the IDW, or is the ocean level for the area. And so where you see orange and gray lines interacting, that's where we're already starting to see saltwater intrusion. So this first area I want to point out, I made a little bigger so you can see it, is that first circle on the left in the map in the top left. That area is already at high tide starting to see the effects of saltwater intrusion. And at low tide, you're seeing that the interaction isn't directly occurring, but like we're starting to get to that. And then if you look into the marsh, we're actually starting to see it's not necessarily interacting directly yet, but as sea level continues to rise, we're going to expect to see more and more interaction of salt and fresh water in the marsh. And so I did that for all of these cross sections throughout the area. And I wanted to pull out each of the points where I think that, or basically along the cross sections where we're seeing salt and freshwater interaction. And so you'll see that for each of the cross sections. And I wanted to further study the salinity profile. And so what I did was I went out to a variety of wells throughout the region and tried to pick out ones that I thought were representative of the wells in their area. So I picked around the center of the island, a well close to the coast, as well as a well near the marsh and one that's within it, and seeing how we're seeing levels of salinity. And for reference, 1500 is about the cutoff of where you see saltwater, or where you're starting to get out of the freshwater realm. So if you look at the island center, throughout you're seeing increased electrical conductivity or salinity with depth, but you're not seeing it such to a point that you're actually starting to be concerned about the salinity level there. And if you look at the ones close to the coast that are up, I think we built this well on like a dune ridge, we actually don't see salinity in the area. It's fairly low throughout. And then if you look at the ones near the marsh, you actually start to see high levels of salinity throughout the entire column. And these are 1 foot increments, like I mentioned earlier. And then if you move all the way out into the marsh a little bit deeper, then you actually start to see, like I was saying earlier, orders of magnitude higher of salinity, suggesting that those areas are already being heavily influenced by, or are already likely experiencing some level of saltwater intrusion. So just to sum up what we've seen so far, we wanted to, in this project, show the shape of the water table, and as well as look at how the seasons are influencing it, wet versus dry. And we've also looked at how the tides are influencing it. And we did so because that's a really good, clear understanding for how sea level rise as a whole, as mean sea level rise continues to increase, how we're going to see salinity on the island. And I highlighted some areas of interest that I think that will warrant further study. And I wanted to hear, I figured this would be something you guys were interested in, ways to use the data that we have earlier. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a massive, robust data set. And what we did for this data set to make these initial maps is look at individual high and low tides. So we had to break it down and pick out just the points for high or low tide. And doing that exact same method, instead picking out, say, king tides, or maybe after heavy rain, we can make the same types of models using the systems that I've already made to simply insert the data, run it, and we'll be able to see the water table with response to those different things. So some of the factors I also thought would be really useful to study would be after a superstorm, or after a few years of green infrastructures being installed, to see how we're seeing or see the benefits from, you know, what maybe infrastructure was installed. And then further, this is going to go into the automation that's being done by Lee. He's already started working on making a water budget for the area. This is just going to be more information because I've already automated how to make these models. So all you'll have to do is plug in the data and you'll be able to go instantly. So in terms of policy, what types of things should be done? There needs to be a focus on moving away from using impervious surface and focusing on pervious surfaces, moving from green to gray, or moving from gray to green infrastructure. And the goal of that is to minimize flooding and improve habitat retention. And they've already been in talks about including in ordinances that the lots that are added need to be pervious surfaces so that we don't, increase those storm discharge levels. And we also need to enhance the usage of buffer zones to enhance infiltration. Low impact developments are also going to be really important to this because as salinity continues to increase in areas such as the marsh, we're going to need to install vegetation that's able to contend with that increase in salinity. So moving away from species that are more vulnerable and using those that are more readily able to handle it. And then also the usage of bioretention ponds has been talked about. In terms of water management practices, there needs to be a limitation on how much of the groundwater is being used for irrigation. Say when the evapotranspirative demand is the greatest, which I showed earlier was actually during the wet season when lots of vegetation is growing, and instead using different resources, say like the surface level resources to water in those situations, because thinning of the freshwater lens can lead to increased interaction between fresh and salt water, and we don't want to see that. Will more wells help in this study? That's an interesting question because these wells are quite time consuming, as I mentioned, to install, and the logger data or the data loggers that go in them are fairly expensive. And so would more be helpful? Well, they're great, the ones that we have. They provide really good local data for that area. But should there be like, say, 20 more wells installed across the island? No, that would be a waste of time, resources, and money. Instead, I could see there being somewhere between like 3 and 5 wells installed, maybe in the areas that I highlighted here. And I picked these areas because they're high value. So 2 things that we want to look for if we're going to install more wells is creating a line that we can use to make a cross section for the area, or we want to insert wells in places that have like these gaps. So I kind of want to show you with my mouse, like here, there aren't very many wells installed. In this area, not too many wells installed, and we don't have any this far out. So those would be the only ones that I would make the suggestion. Instead, I think we should focus on monitoring the pond levels, which ended up being one of the limitations for this study. We had to use static pond levels for the entirety. And looked at like the highest versus the lowest. If we had monthly data for how the ponds were being managed, or I'm sorry, not how they were being managed, but what levels that they're at, then we would have a better understanding of how the water table functions at large in the area at a more specific scale. And so alternatives, because having this constant data is really useful, would be using drive point wells where you just kind of take a point and sledgehammer down and you have a piezometer installed, and that'll capture the data in the same way without being quite as labor intensive. Just going out and doing, monthly measurements with Solent's level tape could actually also be beneficial. And I think that the salinity profile that I showed earlier is really beneficial for understanding how salinity is across the island. I think selecting wells based on different criteria and making those salinity profiles seasonally, as opposed to just the one that we have now, will also be hugely beneficial for understanding salinity across the region. So in conclusion, yes, we are starting to see saltwater intrusion occur, especially within certain areas that are tidally fed, such as out in the marsh or towards the center where the tidal delta was. And in the future, I suggest monitoring those areas that I pulled out in the cross sections doing more monitoring of the ponds, do a more complete analysis of the marsh salinity, and begin seeing how low impact developments can be used, as well as where they'd be, where it would be the best to install them. So I just want to give a big thanks to you guys, obviously, the Kiowa Island Natural Habitat Conservancy, Bryce Motes, who I'm sure you guys know, and the Low Country Hazard Center, the Department of Geology, Projects Advisory Committee, which was Lee and Lucas, Sea Grant, and obviously the Kiowa Island Community Association and the Land and Lakes Department, who helped me install some of the wells. Are there any more questions?
I'm gonna.
You need me to stop
for a
now.
second. I'm gonna share screen for a half second here. Only because this goes back to your question that you had about the datum. And I figured this is the easiest way of answering those questions, okay? So what I've done is I've come to NOAA's site that explains the datums, and you can see I've set the datum, meaning our reference level for NAVD 88, and you can see that it says that this is the 0 for looking at water and elevation in the region. So this would be the 0 on the topo maps, okay? And so then we move up or down depending on what we're seeing. And you can see here that the mean sea level right here, it has a height of minus 0.22. So compared to the other kinds of numbers, on average, compared to the NAVD 88, our area, our mean sea level is slightly lower than that true 0. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. And so what this is showing, if many of you know that they report that the tide height for Hugo, right, in Charleston, and they'll often say it was 12 feet. It was a 12-foot tide, but then you hear it was also a 9-foot tide. What are they referring to? They're referring to this max tide down here. And if I were to change it to the way the Army Corps looks at things, you'll notice that that maximum tide, there's that Hugo tide height that people keep hearing. Because one of the ways they report water, the 0 for water, notice here, it's NAVD 88 is 3 feet taller than the mean low water that boats can get in and out of the harbor with. Okay, so there are different ways of reporting it. We use NAVD 88 because that goes between the bathymetric, the groundwater, and the surface elevation most fluidly. Sorry, most easily to understand. Was that helpful?
Yes.
Yep.
All righty.
So when we look at the heat maps, DJ, and we see values on them like 2, that means that the groundwater level is almost 2 feet above mean sea level. Is that right?
Yep. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen again.
Yes.
Good.
Yes, it is, though. That is exactly right.
That's exactly what he's saying. And so what that's showing in the marsh areas also is it's showing that at low tide, there's a net movement of fresh water into your marsh. Golly gee, that's what we would expect to actually see. Does that, yeah, because that's what we're seeing is it's coming out of the storage and into the marsh at that point. If that helps as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was great, DJ. Thanks for that. Does anybody have any Other specific questions for DJ?
DJ, you had a couple of those maps when you're comparing things to the DEM 2017.
Sure.
That might require explanation what a DEM, what DEM is, but you circled particular areas in this graph that we're looking at right now. You're saying that you're identifying some areas where there's saltwater intrusion. Is that right?
Right. So here, I'll show all of it. What I was looking at here is, imagine the DEM is the elevation of the ground surface, right? So we're actually starting to see interactions within the deep groundwater and the ocean level itself. So like we're starting to see that mixing occur. That's not happening on the surface yet. Did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'm
Oh,
just,
okay.
I just want you to slide over. So this area here, you can see at low tide, there's a this is the freshwater surface. This is the saltwater surface down here, the gray versus the orange. Here you can see at high tide, the freshwater surface is compressed. Yeah. And
yeah, so the freshwater surface is being compressed and the saltwater surface is elevated because it's during high tide. So you're starting to see that interaction between the two. And that's where you're starting to see areas where you see that really high salinity. So if you look at like our ones that we had out in the marsh, if we were to measure it during high tide, we would see like those extremely high levels of salinity, even with respect to if you move like just 5 feet higher in the well. That's why I was suggesting that the salinity profiles are so important, because they really capture how depth and how the interactions are starting to occur as the sea level is starting to increase. So looking at those profiles from high and low tide will give you a better idea of the level of interaction that we're starting to see.
Okay. Now, this, of course, is just 1 year's worth of data.
Right.
It's not during a period of drought or big storms, anything like that. So understand that it's limited. But given what you do know from this year, what kind of shape do you think the island is in? Do we have some immediate things to worry about, or are we in good shape in terms of the groundwater versus?
Great question.
Intrusion?
I think that one of the things that Kiowa has going for it that they've done an incredible job is being so proactive. And in doing so, we're able to see this in the earlier aspects of it. So like we're starting to see, like I said, a little bit of saltwater intrusion in some of the areas out in the marsh, etc. But we're not seeing like extraordinarily high levels of electrical conductivity or salinity in the area. So like, if I were to talk just about like, say that one well where we saw extremely high levels of salinity, that if that was everywhere across the entire island and it was at less depth, so if it was higher up in the wells, then I would say, yeah, we're in a major issue. That's massively concerning. But what I saw in all of these wells across the area is generally fine levels of freshwater salinity. For the most part, we're doing well with regard to that. There are some areas where we're starting to see it, and so we're going to need to be thinking about that proactively as we move into the future, in terms of like what kind of vegetation to plant in the areas to make sure you're not seeing like massive habitat loss or die-offs of plant species. But overall, yeah, we're not seeing such high levels of salinity that we need to be like, panicking.
So pretty good shape.
Yeah.
For this past year.
yeah.
For this past year, yes.
Yeah, never tie that scientist's hands down. He's learning, isn't he?
What is
I'm talking in front of people. Doing it on Zoom freaks me out a little bit.
I agree. Okay. What is the x-axis on these graphs?
Sorry. Oh, that's just a 0. That's like the base elevation.
No, the x-axis.
X-axis.
It's
Over
over time, it's over distance.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. This is that blue line. I think I could have done a better job of explaining this. So everyone can see my mouse. So we're looking at this blue line right here where I'm starting all the way across. The x-axis is literally this blue line.
Okay.
So that gives us the ability to look across the entire area. And so when I was saying that we're seeing interaction here and I called it right here, the reason I'm able to do that is because we drew this line across, and I know that this area where the DEM goes up and down here is right here in the marsh. And I know that this area right here is likely this area right here. So yes, the x-axis is as we move across. It's not always going to be that. It's always going to be showing like the shape of it, but it's not always horizontal because I didn't show any of the vertical moving ones, but these are the same thing though, if that makes sense. And I have made these for all of the cross sections for every month throughout the study. It's just so many that I didn't want to like be overwhelming in the amount of data I provide. Lee has access to all of them. So if you have further questions on say, what is high tide during, July? You could easily go and pull the water table map for that for each of these different cross sections, which show you what's going on in the island.
Okay.
So quick question, DJ. So obviously, this is great data. It's showing us what's happening right now. Obviously, one thing we want to know is, change over time, right? So, if we were to come back and replicate this, every 5 years, every 10 years, I guess what would be your thoughts on that? I know you shared some of your, recommendations, but, and how difficult would it be to basically kind of replicate this same data set over time? And what would you recommend for the frequency?
Oh yeah, no, it's extremely easy actually. I've already developed all of the tools, so it won't be any real legwork on you guys' part besides just plugging in what data you want. You can just run it and you'll be able to see exactly the difference. And there are tools in ArcGIS that can literally pull out the exact differences between 2 points, so that we can literally look at, how is August 2020 versus August 2025, and we can see exactly where things are different. So it's, in terms of what it'll require on y'all's end, very little. It's very simple.
But the results are all relative to that particular year and the precipitation patterns and tides and storms of that particular year.
That's correct.
So I would be a little reluctant to just jump every so many years and take a snapshot. I'd rather be running it continually so that you can pick up
they are
events and longer events like droughts.
Yeah, no, so that's actually one of the major luxuries of this project is that we are getting continuous data. You don't need to be worried about, jumping 5 years in the future unless you specifically wanted to look at 5 years, because you'll have every single year leading up to it, every month of every year. And I think we're switching from 30-minute increments to maybe an hour increments, but it's going to be the same type of data. And all you're going to have to do is pull out exactly what feature you're interested in. So you don't have to worry too much about that, no.
So the wells will continue to be operated.
Yep. I mean, basically now that they're in, you can just leave them. They're pretty much, you go out every, say 3-4 months, pull the loggers, make sure you pull the data. But in terms of capturing, yeah, you can just leave them there.
Okay. Well, I think there's a difference between the town funding a study every 5 years versus low-level funding to get continuous monitoring over time, and then be in place to capture events or longer-term changes that might occur. Is that reasonable?
Could you repeat yourself?
Okay. Rather than snapshots every 3 or 5 years,
right?
And I'm taking this back to funding from the town.
Sure.
So rather than fund, a look every 3 or 5 years, wouldn't it be better to have low-level continuous funding to continue collecting the data?
Absolutely.
So it can be looked at when necessary.
Yes, that is definitely
as
the
well
way
as every 5 years or so.
I wouldn't suggest, going 5 years in the future. The power of this data is that it's so continuous that we can continue to look at like year to year, month to month, how things are changing. And so I do think that well, I mean, if you really wanted to skip 5 years into the future, you could do that, I guess, but I would not suggest it. I think that low level funding and just having the ability to go out, look at what we see in the data every so often throughout, a year is far more useful than, say, giving a massive bulk amount of funding, because the most of the labor intensive and expensive portion of this project, it's on the back end. We've already handled that. We've installed all of these wells. And since, like I was suggesting, more wells isn't really going to be more helpful. That would be like where the bulk of the funding went, was to, help having the materials to go out and install these wells. You don't need another massive bulk of funding unless they've decided on a different type of monitoring technique. With this monitoring technique, no. Continuous low funding would be likely just fine.
Okay. May I ask one final question?
I'm here all day.
No, everybody else might be getting tired of me.
No, I'm kidding. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
If we begin to see vegetation diebacks in certain areas across the island, we would ask the question, why is that happening? Looking at your transects, like you are showing here, we would see areas where we might expect that to happen, or that might be able to explain why there is dieback in particular areas.
Mm-hmm.
Is that one way to interpret the data?
Yes, obviously, it's a very dynamic system, and there are lots of factors that could be leading to a die-off. But if we're starting to see die-offs in these areas, this is certainly the first thing I would look at, because we're starting to see these effects of increased salinity. And so down the road, if we're seeing, like, say, right in this area, the vegetation starts to die off, then yes, you could expect it to be due to the salinity.
Good, thank you.
Are there any more questions?
I think we're good. Thanks again, DJ. Great job.
Yep. Thank you.
Really good job.
Thank you all.
All right. So now we'll move on with the rest of the agenda. Hopefully we can get through it pretty quick, but that was a good conversation to have, and really interesting data. So I'm going to just run through old business pretty quick. I don't have a lot. Actually, don't have anything on the first three. So we'll hop down to Grow Native, and I'll just give you a quick update. I know I mentioned at our last meeting that we've got a landscape project here at Town Hall, which we've selected the contractor for that. And that work will be completed before March of 2022. And so next is going to be Rodenticides and Wildlife. Just give you a quick couple of updates on that. First, on the Clemson PhD study. Not a whole lot of change from our last meeting. The PhD student, Megan, is on board. She will have her full proposal completed next week. And then she will send that out to review through her graduate committee, which I'm sitting on. So I'll see that next week. And then she'll formally defend her proposal, present her proposal to the committee in late November, early December. And then once that's all squared away, it'll be available for everyone to see. And I may share the draft version with the committee once I have it as well. And then it'll go to the Conservancy. Jane, I don't know when the board meets in December, but sometime in December, I know the board was going to look at that and talk about funding.
Yeah, our meeting is going to be on the 14th, the Board of Trustees, and we will have an executive board on the 7th, the Tuesday before that.
Okay, so we need to go on the 7th or the 14th?
I would start it with the 7th if possible,
Okay.
because we need to look at it, I think, before the board looks at it.
Okay, yeah, so that should work.
Great.
But yeah, so excited to get that project underway. A couple of other things.
Jim,
Recently, yep.
maybe Megan could present to us as well, since the town is one of the funders.
She certainly could. Trying to think when exactly that could happen. I don't know. Let me work on that. Maybe we'll,
It doesn't have to be in time for the Conservancy,
Right. Sure.
maybe January's meeting or something like that.
Yeah,
So
certainly that would
The
make
town
sense.
committee knows what's going on too.
Absolutely. That's a good idea. So also on the issue of rodenticides, obviously, we continue to test animals. We haven't tested as many, in recent months because we just haven't recovered as many, but we're still continuing that effort. Recently, actually in 2020, the EPA did basically an interim assessment of the impacts of these 7 anticoagulant rodenticides basically in the environment. So they're kind of going through a review process, which may result in some changes to the regulation of these products. So to that end, I was encouraged to submit all of our incident reports to the EPA. An incident report would be any encounter where, an animal or a plant is negatively impacted by a pesticide. So I've now submitted all 52 of our incident reports. So hopefully that information will be helpful to the EPA and will help in their decision-making on how they regulate these products going forward. Anybody have any questions on that? All right, so we'll skip to deer management. We completed our first survey in October. Numbers are up again from last year, which isn't a real big surprise. But we've got another set of surveys that'll take place in either early December or early January. And then at that point, we'll average those 2 surveys, and that'll give us our annual density. And then we'll come up with a recommendation for a harvest level for this year. But it's likely going to be probably in the neighborhood of 200 deer this year. Next is Kiowa Conservancy projects, but we don't have, I guess, Jane, do you have any updates you want to, you got
Yes,
it. All right.
Lee sent me some information that I
Very
need
good.
to share with you, if that's possible. Great presentation by DJ, really interesting, the groundwater study. But the marsh vulnerability study, Lee met with Dr. Levine and Landon to discuss the creation of a map outlining suitable sites for marsh, in the marsh for living shorelines, which I'm excited about, and I would love to see these projects go forward. We'll be incorporating information gathered in phase 2 of current site conditions to synthesize what practices would work where. And then all the data products produced by the project will be placed on the College of Charleston's website for future use. And then along with that, digital copies of the data being made available to the town and conservancy. Okay, for the integrated watershed study, following approval of the project by town council, the conservancy met with the South Carolina DNR researchers at Fort Johnson for further discussion. This was to get a better understanding of the environmental and meteorological monitoring efforts in the Ace Basin for determining best practices. Some topics discussed were considerations for water quality monitoring equipment for high salinity environments, deployment methods and procedures for maintaining data integrity, among others. They stress the need for these sondes to be continually wiped to prevent fouling and maintain a level of accuracy in the readings, especially for long-term deployments. They suggested deploying and calibrating the equipment in 2-week time periods based on protocols. And going on, they also showcased a method for remotely collecting and logging weather data that does not require cell service or wireless internet connection, and using similar equipment such as those that already exist on Kiowa. And now that the final due diligence for understanding monitoring methods is complete, the conservancy will soon start the process for getting the equipment. And additionally, code is being currently written for streamlining data analysis and creating seasonal water budgets. And he sent me a whole list of things that I did not understand any of that data collection. And I'll be glad to share it, but he said, nobody will understand it. It's, but that's what Lee did. He's actually teaching class at College of Charleston today, so he couldn't be here. But all of this is very exciting with the water project, the groundwater study, and now looking at mitigation in the marsh and the work they've done there. I think next year, hopefully we'll be able to be putting in something in the marsh for those living shorelines. So that's his report. Any questions?
Right. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? All right, we'll move on to the Green Initiative.
Putting something in the water for living shorelines is where it is really needed, where something is happening. We're experiencing erosion somewhere. So that's what we need to be looking for. And then the living shoreline might be the mitigation approach. Yes. I mean, it's not just finding something to do. You know, we're not trying to find a location in order to do something.
And those are being,
a location that needs something.
Yeah.
And then we might be able to do something there.
Exactly. And that's what the marsh studies are showing us places. And he's already mentioned 2 sites. One is at Rhett's Bluff, and the other one I think is around Sea Marsh there. But the Rhett's Bluff would be the first place that they're looking at that has a problem that was noted in the marsh vulnerability study in the mapping.
That's documenting the erosion that's taking place.
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right, now we'll move on to you, Dr. Parker, Green Initiative Working Group. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, we've had a series of meetings. We communicated the initial results of that to the community at large, maybe a month to 6 weeks ago. And we're in a stage now where everybody's got their homework. They're going out into the wilderness and doing good things. And we will be meeting again at the beginning of next year to check in and with base and see where we are. The big thing that I'm kind of excited about and hope that it will work is Kika is beta testing using some battery packs instead of 2-cycle gasoline engines for their landscaping maintenance. My understanding is that those are not as robust as they need to be. They're fairly expensive, but they might be usable in terms of everything other than leaf blowing. So we could at least reduce it in terms of the edging and trimming and that sort of stuff. I had some conversations with a coastal community down in Florida that went this route several years ago, and they have had a lot of pushback back from the commercial side because these batteries are very, very expensive, and they've got a durability of about 35 to 40 minutes for each charge. And so you've got to charge them, then they're down for a while. Charge them, then they're down for a while, or else you've got to buy 10 plus batteries at $3,000 a pop. So it's not as I'm not as enthused about that as I was originally, but like I said, Kika is experimenting and trying different variations on a theme, and that's the big thing that's going on right now. The resort is doing some actions. The club is doing some actions. The town is writing their contracts with landscapers and what. I'm sorry, but I have to take another call. I'll come back to you.
All right. We'll move on, and when Dr. Parker gets back, he can finish. So we don't have any new business. So we'll move to reports from the entities. We'll start with the town. I've just got 1 or 2 quick things. So I don't know. I can't recall if I've mentioned to the committee that the town. You're probably aware, but the town periodically flies aerial photography, ortho photography of the island. We typically do it every 3 to 4 years. So our last flight was in 2018. So we are flying again this winter in January or February of 2022. Initially, we had planned to only fly orthos, so just aerial photography. But we've now decided, after meeting with the Conservancy and the community association and having a number of lengthy discussions that we're going to fly LiDAR again. So we're going to actually so we're going to get slightly more detailed orthos this time than we have in the past. So we're going to move from a 3-inch pixel resolution down to 2 inches. So there'll be much crisper images, and we'll really be able to see a lot of detail. With our LiDAR, we're going to go very, very high intensive on that. So we're going to get incredibly accurate LiDAR data across the board. And we've also decided to pay for some pretty substantial post-processing of that LiDAR data. And effectively what we're going to end up with is not only a standard, DEM or digital elevation model of the island, which basically tells you, right, the height of the land surface throughout the island. But we're going to get it, at least for all of the developed areas, we'll effectively have design grade elevation. So effectively about as good as if you hired a surveyor to go out there and do it on the ground. And so it's going to be really beneficial data for all the entities. So we're excited to get that project going this winter. So any questions on that?
The LiDAR will be of the resolution that you can use some of Norm's processes to map vegetation very accurately across the island.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it will be, I think, we had a couple of options with how dense the LiDAR points would be, or how many pulses per second that the LiDAR equipment would be sending. And so we're going to get incredibly detailed data, and yes, you can tease out, canopy heights and vegetation heights and all of that. So that can all be easily done. With the data we will have, it won't be mapping vegetation heights won't be part of the project with the mapping company. They'll be mainly focused on ground elevations, break lines, and that sort of thing. But we certainly have already talked with Lee and Lucas and those about getting that data teased out. So we'll have all of the raw data to use.
Right. Lee and Lucas working with Norm should be able to have some very good vegetation maps identifying a lot of things and species just from the LiDAR.
Correct.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. That'll be good for both of them.
Absolutely.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
One question. I don't know if you're done with the Tanakiwa Island report. Was there any follow-up on the no wake zone letter we discussed last meeting?
That is a good question. I don't know. I know that I forwarded the committee's recommendation that we send that letter, but I need to follow up and see if the letter was sent. But I haven't heard anything new on that
Okay.
topic.
Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, that's all I've got. So we'll move on to the community association. Matt, you have anything?
Yeah, just a few quick things. I guess currently I'm still kind of working on my pond edge improvement project. So kind of large scale pruning is what it mostly is. And then coming back in and replanting to get kind of just a better shoreline vegetation. It improves erosion control, and it's also just kind of better habitat than what the overgrown business that's around all the ponds is. So kind of that's just ongoing. I know I've talked about it a couple of times, so I don't want to get too deep into that. We're also working on our yearly fish tissue sampling. So there's, I don't know, about a dozen places around the island that are popular fishing locations. And, some people want to keep fish out of the ponds. And so we do tissue samples looking at heavy metals and pesticides, send that off to a lab and get that worked up. Just in case there is something that shows up, we can notify guests and property owners to not keep the fish that they're catching in the ponds. Fortunately, we don't really ever come up with anything. So from a health standpoint, that's good. So we're working on getting those samples collected, and I guess a little bit to go on with Jim's deer population update. We've dealt with in the past month a fair number of deer vehicle collision incidences, but it's not too surprising just given the time of year they're kind of running around. So their breeding time of year. So it's not uncommon to have more vehicle collisions, but I just thought it was worth noting since the population seemed to be a little bit higher this year, even after doing some work to thin them out. So that's about it for us.
All right, thanks, Matt. Golf resort. Did we lose Liz? I think Liz left. Next is the ARB, and I don't know if all of you know, Tommy Manuel is joining our committee. He's the new ARB director. So welcome to the committee. Do you have anything you want to share?
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for the welcome, and nice to meet you all, and glad to be on the Zoom call. We don't have anything at this time.
Thank you, sir. Conservancy. Anything else, Jane? All right, Turtle Patrol. Lynn, what you got? Anything?
Well, yes, I mean, our season ended about a week earlier than it did last year. Our last inventory was October 7th. But it was a pretty good year. We ended up, once Sandy Point nests were removed from the Kiowa logs in seaturtle.org, we ended up with 343 nests. So that was pretty good. And Sunday night, the Conservancy, the Legacy Gala, they presented the Kiowa Turtle Patrol with the 2021 Conservationist of the Year Award. And it is on display at Town Hall. I'm not sure where Stephanie Tillerson decided to put it, but I left it in the lobby with Julie because Stephanie was in a meeting with you, Jim. Anyway, I'm sure they were going to find a spot to put it, but I thought that was the appropriate place for it to be because it was an award for the entire Turtle Patrol. So it was quite an honor.
Very good.
And I want to say that Lynn did an excellent job and gave information that I'm sure most of the people in the ballroom did not know, and especially about some of our turtles like our Stumpy and some other things that, and I really appreciate what she said that night. Really did a good job.
All right.
But other than that, that's it. We're done.
Yeah, until next year. Right?
Until next year.
Right. All right. So no citizens comments. I don't have any comments. Committee member comments. Anybody else have anything? All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.